Story 1. You will learn more about orbital mechanics in 20 minutes of Kerbal Space Program tutorials than you would in your entire life. Story 2. They helped my literacy because they came before voiceovers were added to games in the 2000s. My vocabulary was impressive thanks to Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 3. The more recent Assassin's Creed games have educational modes where combat is disabled, and you can roam around historical sites and have a small digital tour guide give you information about them. It is really impressive. I loved the Egypt one in particular with all of the pyramid details. Story 4. I learned programming from Little Big Planet and later learned about transistors in Little Big Planet 2. Story 5. Age of Empires. My general early knowledge of civilizations and their heroes is mixed within the rich history of the game. Story 6. Paradox games like Hearts of Iron can be useful for learning geography. National borders often change, but cities and other features usually remain the same. Story 7. Many people who are being scammed have obviously never played RuneScape. Story 8. I got a lot of quality reading practice and problem solving from early Pokemon games as a kid. Story 9. Elite Dangerous created a model of the Milky Way and included real stars and locations. I visited some of the largest stars in our galaxy. I used Wikipedia to find the names of the large stars. Then I tried to locate them in the game. I learned a lot about stars and the Milky Way this way. Story 10. RuneScape, or at least old-school RuneScape. I haven't played RuneScape 3 since the evolution of combat. Story 11. I used the entire game Assassin's Creed 3 minus the assassin part for a report on the Revolutionary War. I got the highest grade in the class. Story 12. Real-time strategy games such as StarCraft and Warcraft require resource and time management, efficiency, and similar skills. Story 13. Every time you start a new game, you must learn a new world with its own rules and logic. Some games are more educational, but all require learning how they work and encourage brain plasticity. Story 14. Bethesda games actually did improve my vocabulary. You should have seen the women when they heard me say cadre instead of group. Not a dry pair of panties in a mile radius. Story 15. This War of Mine. I believe it is the best anti-war game currently available. Compared to mainstream first- or third-person war shooters, this War of Mine focuses on ordinary people struggling to survive amid the brutality of war. They live difficult lives among ruins, constantly worrying about food and water and sometimes killing each other. The game has no flashy guns or heroic epics of shooting enemy soldiers. It shows naked humanity and the cruelty of war toward the working class. Story 16. I participated in a graduate study testing weather puzzle games, specifically Dr. Layton and the 2 Nintendo DS games in the Legend of Zelda series, could improve critical thinking skills. From the small portion of the paper I read, despite my scores remaining embarrassingly low, the games did seem to help the other participants. Story 17. The Metal Gear series offers amazing context and commentary on war and societal corruption. Story 18. You cannot help but learn a bit about European history by playing either Europa Universalis or Crusader Kings. Story 19. In my opinion, some driving games can teach you the approximate physics of a car. It sounds stupid, but I think I was able to correct a pretty bad skid because I played Need for Speed a lot as a kid. Story 20. Most games have something to teach and are often labeled uneducational. Most notably, turn-based strategy games such as Civilization and battling games such as Pokemon are great at teaching mathematics. Story 21. Disco Elysium is one of the finest works of literature of the last decade. Story 22. Majora's Mask taught me saving skills. I learned that if I put some rupees in the bank each time, even a small amount, over time I built substantial savings. Story 23. Factorio contains a huge amount of real-world science and engineering baked into the deoxyribonucleic acid of this game. It is truly remarkable given how good a game it is. Story 24. Paradox games capture history well. They do more than present facts and places. They put you in the mindset to consider the real political and economic driving forces of the period. Story 25. Plague Inc. I mean it. Even if it is not 100% realistic, It is a neat way to learn about diseases and full-scale pandemics. Story 26. Kerbal Space Program is basically a physics degree disguised as explosions and little green men. Story 27. Pokemon. So much reading definitely helped me when I was 9 or 10 years old. Story 28. Minecraft even became famous when someone managed to create a chatbot using blocks from the game. Story 29. The old-school Call of Duty games introduced me to history. I learned about the 761st Tank Battalion in Call of Duty, Finest Hour, and about Omaha Beach in Call of Duty 2. Story 30. I used the Souls games to illustrate resilience when I was teaching, encouraging students not to give up after making mistakes. The Souls series is particularly brutal in that regard. Story 31. In RimWorld, you really learn about new war crimes and the Geneva Convention. Story 32. So I'm from Australia, and in my youth some of us played the game America's Army, developed as a recruiting tool for the United States Army. It had tutorials you had to complete before you could play multiplayer online. To be able to act as a medic, you had to sit through a class and then pass a test. I remember learning to apply a tourniquet and marking an injured person with a large T on the forehead along with the time it was applied so medical staff would know. I thought that was really cool. It included questions about people on the battlefield and identifying shock and similar issues. For a 2005-era game, it was phenomenal, and I remember it fondly. Story 33. Portal and Portal 2. A masterclass in spatial reasoning and puzzles. Players must use portals to manipulate momentum, trajectory, and gravity to solve complex challenges. Understanding of physics concepts such as momentum and velocity, along with lateral thinking, is required. Story 34. Horizon Zero Dawn largely warned us about Elon Musk. Now we are just watching and waiting for Ted Faro to fuck us all. Story 35. World of Tanks and War Thunder introduced a new generation to historical military weaponry and the World War II rabbit hole. I ended up watching documentaries and reading articles. Story 36. Age of Empires. I swear to God, it teaches strategic planning so you never forget it. Story 37. The Paradox interactive game Victoria 3 gives a decent idea of what the world looked like at the game's start date, although it is not 100% accurate. It can teach aspects of politics and political stances, as well as the very basic levers by which laws were enacted. It also suggests which regions historically could produce or harvest particular resources successfully. It is a good way to see which resources were known in the past and how resources were eventually discovered, such as gold. No need to fuss about its accuracy. I am not delusional and do not expect it to get everything right. Story 38. Unironically, League of Legends. Working memory, fluid reasoning, and processing speed are metrics on intelligence tests. Holding information about skill timers, objectives, and enemy positions, visualizing enemy responses based on their resources, and executing a high number of actions per minute during fights all engage those abilities. The game also gives immediate feedback on poor decisions in fast-paced situations. At its core, if you make a misstep, you get punished by the enemy, which produces rapid learning. The tenacity of people willing to engage in a mentally taxing 40-minute task is impressive, especially in a world of increasingly short-form content. Story 39. Fossil Fighters teaches you about dinosaurs. The facts are surface level, but it includes many dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures that most people probably did not know existed. Story 40. There are lots of games about war, but Fire Emblem, Three Houses taught many people that they do not want to go to war. Okay, so it is only one lesson, but a pretty important one. Story 41. Railroad Tycoon taught me about stocks and bonds and terms like book value. The various SimCity games taught me at a high level how a city works and about budget management, planning, and utilities. Story 42. Grand Theft Auto is a faithful depiction of cycles of poverty across contemporary eras. Story 43. Cities Skylines. The moment I set foot in America, I thought the game was ridiculously accurate. Story 44. I have an unnaturally good understanding of European geography and which cities or regions belong to which countries because of Paradox games. The most recent one I sank my teeth into was Crusader Kings. I've never lived in Europe. From what I hear about Europa Universalis 5, they cranked that up to a 10. Story 45. Kerbal Space Program is genuinely one of the best orbital mechanics and rocket science teaching tools available. I learned more about Delta V and transfer orbits from that game, and why National Aeronautics and Space Administration engineers are all secretly insane, than I ever did in physics class. Story 46. SimCity. Learn how to budget, set tax rates, allocate government funds for services and amenities, and how those decisions can improve or harm residents. Story 47. Grand Theft Auto 5 teaches a good lesson about driving. Other drivers will do stupid, unpredictable things. Story 48. I had to do a lot of math to optimize my massively multiplayer online role-playing game characters, mostly World of Warcraft. Story 49. Grand strategy games from Paradox can teach a lot about history and geography, particularly if you play outside the major countries. The Paradox Plaza forums contain many excellent after-action reports, many of which read better than the average alternate history book. Story 50. The Ocarina of Time definitely improved my reading, problem-solving, and other skills. Story 51. I learned a lot from Anno 1800 because it's based on reality. Story 52. It's been about 20 years since I first played RuneScape. I was the fastest kid in school on a keyboard from about 3rd grade onward. I learned that by spamming selling lobbies, selling items for 400 gold pieces each for hours. A useful skill is a useful skill. Story 53. Before localization issues and translated games, video games were a great way to learn English. I learned more from PlayStation 2 role-playing games than I did in middle and high school. Story 54. Cyberpunk. We are much closer to that world than people think. It is not a dystopia. It is our reality. Story 55. Goat Simulator. I benefit greatly from knowing how to be a goat. Story 56. European Union 4. Geography, economics, and history, with a dash of the mind-numbing boredom of number crunching for efficiency. Story 57. I learned a great deal about history just by playing Total War. Granted, it is mostly history through a military lens, but still. Story 58. I give a lot of credit to puzzle games and real-time strategy games for helping with general life problem solving. I am thinking of Portal, Bloons Tower Defense, and Halo Wars. I have not played StarCraft, but I should at some point. I will also admit that I have no evidence to back up this claim. Laughing out loud. Story 59. Brother. A Tale of Two Sons. Because sometimes even when you win, you lose. Life can just suck in general. Story 60. Wall Street Raider is like taking a serious finance course. It teaches how investments, companies, stocks, bonds, options, commodities, futures, insurance, banking, mergers and acquisitions, and macroeconomics work. Capitalism Lab is another good option for economics. It focuses on running a business. Historical war games, such as those on Matrix Games and Slytherin, teach history, geography, resource management, coordination of forces, and planning to achieve objectives within a limited time frame using available resources despite unknown opposition. Story 61. The Total War games, specifically medieval, taught a valuable combination of history and geopolitics. Story 62. As surprising as it may sound, the Ace Combat series taught me a great deal about grief, politics, and ideologies. Story 63. Final Fantasy Tactics teaches most of what anyone needs to know about class and the political elite. If it were a novel from the 1950s instead of a video game from the 1990s, it would be part of a high school curriculum along the lines of Animal Farm. Story 64. Although it may not be the first choice for many, Minecraft requires a lot of logical thinking. It does not hold your hand when showing you how to do many things and encourages exploration, creativity, and problem solving, which are useful real-world skills. Story 65. World of Warcraft helps people learn to function within large groups and teams. It is incredibly useful in the corporate world. Story 66. I know it has been heavily memed, but Among Us teaches deduction based on what people say or do not say. The way players must strategize when to vote can be a useful mathematical lesson. For example, do not vote when there are 7 members, because the wrong vote can lead to a double imposter win condition at 6 members. This also applies to other similar games, such as Mafia and Werewolf. Suspicious. Story 67. SimCity 4 shows that governments are not managing economies properly. Story 68. Minecraft. It actually takes talent to create machines in a game that's made of blocks. Story 69. Minecraft is a great game for learning computer science. Redstone is a brilliant way to learn concepts of computer logic. People constantly push the game's limits by manipulating mechanics to automate resource gathering or even to create fully functioning web browsers inside the game. Story 70. God of War got me hooked on Greek mythology and now on Norse mythology too. Story 71. I picked up a surprising amount of information and learned to type quickly playing RuneScape. I went from nearly failing computer class in 6th grade because I could not type fast enough to an average speed of about 70 words per minute, and I believe most of that improvement came from practicing in the game almost every day. Story 72. Old school RuneScape teaches economics, improves typing skills, and helps you spot scams. Story 73. Civilization games 4, 5, and 6 in particular. Natural wonders. World leaders. Man-made wonders. If I ever win the lottery, I will hand the list of wonders to a travel agent and say go. Story 74. Massively multiplayer online games provide training in social dynamics and conflict resolution. Story 75. Cities, skylines, and farming simulator taught me a lot I did not know. Story 76. I coach a trivia team for my high school students. I recall past seasons when students only answered certain geography questions correctly because of the video game Call of Duty. Story 77. Has anyone played Oxygen Not Included and actually built a fully functional autonomous base? Mad props. Story 78. Define educational value. Do you mean learning the alphabet or learning things you might use later? If you mean the former, any game specifically designed for that purpose qualifies. If you mean the latter, I can explain how video games improve hand-eye coordination and why that matters, or discuss many narrative-based single-player games and how they explore themes that require critical thinking. Games are no longer simple like Galaga, where you moved a joystick to shoot an alien. They are much more complex, so asking which ones provide more educational value is somewhat rhetorical. Story 79. I learned low-level city planning and building orientation from Dark Cloud. Story 80. I learned to read playing classic 8 and 16-bit console role-playing games. Story 81. My cousins used to have a game on their Atari called Anticipation that was like a spelling and picture game. Story 82. DayZ has made me a formidable navigator during my time playing. Story 83. Treasure Mathstorm is free to play online. It is terrific for early elementary-age children. I think the games I played as a kid gave me a strong ability to read maps. My wife never played games and has difficulty reading maps. She cannot mentally translate between map representations and real-world perspectives. Story 84. Driving games, even Grand Theft Auto games, require more hand-eye coordination than most real-life driving situations. Although it may seem ridiculous to compare real life to those games, the biggest driving mishaps are caused by inattention. Compared with video games, real-life driving is like removing weights from a baseball bat before stepping up to the plate. Story 85. I think some games with artistic merit improve media literacy. Beautifully written titles can evoke deep emotions and encourage deeper reflection. Clair Obscur is a recent example that immediately comes to mind, along with Undertale and To the Moon, which demonstrate how the medium can be used as a sublime work of art. Story 86. I know the geographic locations and populations of most countries from playing Plague Incorporated. I do not think the population figures have been updated in some time. Story 87. Lego games offer amazing problem-solving puzzles. I always played with my child, and the games helped them work through solutions. Story 88. Just Dance taught me both rhythmic and fine motor skills. I learned so many basic dance moves, and some songs are decent fitness challenges. Story 89. Honestly, any video game that has actual quality, but not the sloppy ones like typical mobile games, unless you are trying to learn what regret feels like, laughing my ass off. Story 90. I used Manhunt for a report on pacifism for my philosophy degree. Story 91. Every title I played during my childhood accumulated and shaped how I understand various logical concepts and constructs. When I play as a character, I immediately understand there is an objective to complete. I have to identify the goal, determine how to achieve it, and consider the reward. When I arrive at a special location with different music, I know something is going to happen soon. When I can use different items and weapons, I evaluate their differences, what each will do, and when I should or should not use them. These logical habits carry over to the real world, such as how I troubleshoot when my laptop is not working, how I recognize patterns in math problems, and how I manage my finances, including what is a priority, why it is more important, and the trade-offs versus what I gain. Story 92. I pretty much learned to read and built my vocabulary by reading everything in Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo Entertainment System role-playing games. Story 93. The Fate series has taught me about 450 historical figures and mythological characters. Many of them are given a spin. For example, Jack the Ripper is portrayed as a manifestation of the unborn children of prostitutes who had abortions, and she cuts their stomachs open so they can be born. That prompted me to research and learn historical facts and myths about characters I find interesting and to see how the creators drew inspiration. I would never have found that information otherwise. Story 94. Mafia 3. I know the story is fictional and many of the timelines are somewhat inaccurate, but it touches on real history and groups that existed in the 1960s. Story 95. I have an annoyingly deep knowledge of tanks from before 2000 thanks to World of Tanks and War Thunder. Like most people, when they watch a movie they think the tank is appropriate for the setting. Meanwhile, I can identify the model, year of production, upgrades, drawbacks, and so on. It is a useless skill unless I visit a tank museum. The games themselves did not help much, but I have always liked war history, and they gave me a novel niche to explore. Story 96. I learned a lot about Norse mythology while playing the new God of War, especially from Mimir's stories. I also learned a bit about Greek mythology from the first God of War. Story 97. Role-playing games are good for reading, and massively multiplayer online games are good for writing and realistic language use, which helps when learning a language by immersing yourself in it. Story 98. I learned a great deal about real-world driving mechanics from Gran Turismo. Story 99. Two games immediately come to mind. Animal Crossing taught me a lot about various bugs and fish. RuneScape taught me a wealth of common and more niche knowledge. Story 100. BeamNG and League of Legends, or any competitive massively multiplayer online game, will make you a better driver. Final Fantasy VIII had no voice acting, which made me a better reader when I was an adolescent. As top comment alluded, Assassin's Creed is historically educational. Story 101. Wolfenstein, because yes, shooting Nazis should be normalized. Story 102. Grand strategy games taught me a surprising amount about the history of Poland in the 15th century. It is not from books. Story 103. In Clash Royale, many things can be seen as positive or negative elixir trades in real life. Story 104. Minecraft. My son learned a lot about coding from command blocks and working with Redstone. Story 105. Rock Band offers several benefits. First, it teaches about popular rock-driven bands across the decades in one interactive package. Second, in Rock Band 3, if you play on the professional difficulty level and use a Roland electronic drum kit with individual drum pads, you learn the drum chart for each song. Story 106. Satisfactory. The process of building factories for automated production of various parts is, I have found, a surprisingly good analog for how software is developed, especially when you start exploring alternative recipes and determining optimal production chains. If Coffee Stain were to add simulated programmable logic controllers and supervisory control and data acquisition systems to the game, they could probably find a sneaky way to train people for jobs in industrial automation. Story 107. Power Wash Simulator will teach you a lot more about architecture than you ever bargained for. Story 108. I have not seen any mention of RuneScape. RuneScape and other massively multiplayer online games have done wonders for a whole generation in communication, scam detection, patience, and problem-solving. Story 109. Tetris taught me how to move L-shaped sectionals around tight corners. Story 110. Burnout Paradise teaches you how driving a car at 200 miles per hour will fold your car in. Story 111. Raiding in World of Warcraft taught me a lot about the importance of teamwork. Nowadays, raids and boss fights are so complex at higher difficulties that you really need full voice coordination and sometimes advanced planning to succeed. A team of 10 to 25 players needs to work in unison, elect a raid leader, and maintain a hierarchy. Each player often has designated roles and responsibilities in the fight, and each of you must perform exactly as required to win. I have seen 24 people listening to one person and doing what he said as if he were their boss, not because he actually was, but because they all realized that was the best and most efficient way to succeed in the game. They all shared a common goal. Teamwork matters. You each have a role to fulfill, and sometimes even one mistake by one person can be fatal for every member of the team. I have seen people working together better in a video game than at my job in real life. Story 112. Path of Exile. What value does a fixed currency have compared to raw bartering? Anno 2070. Global economic cycle of goods and trade routes. Defense of the ancients. How to speak Russian and hate yourself. Old school RuneScape. How to scam kids. EVE Online. How to scam ex-military. Story 113. Pokemon. As a 5-year-old, I learned how to read really quickly because of it. It also taught me to ask my parents for definitions of words. My friends and I who played Pokemon were the only 5-year-olds who understood words like magnitude. Story 114. Grand strategy for a holistic problem-solving approach, offering historical information and geopolitical knowledge. Classic role-playing game for vocabulary, empathy, human nature, and general knowledge. Otherwise, mostly niche knowledge and hand-eye coordination. Story 115. The Samurai Warriors topic gave me some useful information about the Warring States era of Japan. Story 116. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Feels a bit like a gamified Encarta to me. Story 117. In any game focused on build theory crafting, you learn different applications of mathematics to discover the best options. Story 118. Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors sparked a major interest in ancient Chinese and feudal Japanese history without being actively educational in any way. Laugh out loud. Just knowing that these extraordinary events actually happened and these people really existed made me want to read more about them. Of course, I know now that the real Oda Nobunaga probably did not have a lightsaber or a feather boa, and Zhang Jiao probably was not a flaming Jesus, but I have never been able to get into other narrative-driven games after playing those. Even well-renowned stories like Final Fantasy seem childish and tropey compared with the layers of history and legend in Dynasty Warriors, and learning more about Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Records of the Three Kingdoms, and the actual archaeological findings from the Three Kingdoms period of ancient China adds even more depth. Story 119. Warcraft, Age of Empires, Civilization, and other resource management games. Story 120. Age of Mythology and the Percy Jackson books taught me a great deal about gods and heroes. Story 121. I learned about supply and demand economics by playing Ocarina of Time. Story 122. Assassin's Creed may not be entirely accurate. Some parts are informative, and later games include a guided tour. Story 123. It is not a video game per se, but I have played trading card games all my life, and I have always felt they have taught me a great deal, particularly Magic: The Gathering. Story 124. Fallout: New Vegas. It sounds strange to call it educational, but it quietly teaches politics, philosophy, and consequence better than most classrooms. Every faction is a lesson in ideology. You see how power warps people and how survival changes morals. It is not about right or wrong. It is about why people choose one or the other. Story 125. I was late to the party, but early role-playing games, especially the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series, really helped me develop reading comprehension. You had to understand clues from non-player characters to find where to go, so you needed solid reading skills. I developed those skills playing those games when I was 8 to 11 years old. Story 126. Various massively multiplayer online games have taught me countless names of ores and other raw crafting materials. Story 127. I have always credited violent video games for my perfect English. Story 128. Japanese role-playing game series such as Final Fantasy and Shin Megami Tensei taught me about, or sparked my interest in, the mythology of different cultures through their summons and demons. Story 129. Many of them do. I learned about geography playing Sid Meier's Pirates. I learned about orbital mechanics playing Kerbal Space Program. I learned about history playing Paradox map painting games and so on. Most games teach you something. Story 130. The Oregon Trail is surprisingly educational and teaches resource management while being fun. Story 131. Factorio will teach you programming, from basic to advanced concepts. Story 132. I am really good at backing up a trailer and I attribute that fully to Grand Theft Auto. Story 133. In my adult life, I have been relearning lessons from Civilization. I also raise children between turns. Story 134. Elite Dangerous is built on real astronomy and an impressive simulation of our galaxy based on the state of astrophysics in 2014, when it was made, except for faster-than-light travel for gameplay convenience. As you progress in the game, you begin to understand more about stars and planets because the astrophysics of star systems has subtle and sometimes not-so-subtle gameplay ramifications that eventually become worth paying attention to. Story 135. I'm probably only as good at scripting as I am now because of countless hours of redstone engineering. Story 136. First-person shooter games can greatly improve situational awareness and hand-eye coordination. They may not have high educational value, but they teach skills that are worthwhile to have and to excel at. They can also help with activities such as driving and sports. Story 137. This is probably only applicable to me. When I was a kid, I could never remember which way east and west were. While playing A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a non-player character near the start of the game said that her husband went off to the east, and I knew that was where I needed to go. I went to the bird statue in town, saw that east was to the right on its compass, and that knowledge has stuck with me ever since. Story 138. Minecraft fosters spatial reasoning and systemic thinking through open-ended problem-solving in physics-based environments. Story 139. The historical elements in war games based on an actual war are remarkably accurate. Story 140. I know pilots who credited the old Microsoft Flight Simulator models with making them confident in flying real aircraft before they had regular access to them. I imagine the modern Microsoft Flight Simulator, with in-depth cockpit functions and real-world flight times, is widely used by up-and-coming pilots. Story 141. Persona 5. I'm not talking about the subjects you learn at the school in the game like math, history, and English. I mean life. 2 things I learned from the game. 1. How important my time is and that it is solely my choice how I spend it. 2. That everything I do changes who I am. I know it sounds stupid. I would have said the same thing before I played it. But that game had the power to change me. Story 142. While it has more training value than educational value, the original Super Monkey Ball was apparently so precise that surgeons could use it to exercise their dexterity and motor skills. It has even been acknowledged by the National Institutes of Health. Story 143. Minecraft teaches creativity and encourages players to obtain the things they want or need. If you want to see something cool, you go find it. If you want to build something that works, learn how. It is a great game for young engineers. Story 144. Hollow Knight. You learn very quickly how unfair everything is. But if you push through the pain to the end, you will get better, and it will all be worth it. No joke. Real life is like that too. Story 145. Zachtronics games are considered nerdy and educational, but I gained more skill in assembly language programming and digital logic from playing those games than from taking university classes on those subjects. Story 146. I used Minecraft as an example while tutoring a child in geography. Story 147. I remember a Silent Hill game during algebra. I was thrilled because it was the first time since high school that I got to play it. Story 148. Gran Turismo taught me a lot about cars, and now I get very excited when I see someone with an imported Japanese domestic market K car or an obscure European model that is non-existent here in the United States. Story 149. It is an oldie, Red Baron, Red Baron 2, and Red Baron 3D. It came with a collection of books describing the histories of the various aircraft, biographies of the aces, and a general historical summary of World War I. I learned much about World War I and aviation from this game, which ignited my passion and determined my college major and career path. Story 150. Extraterrestrial combat taught me a lot about flanking and teamwork with different units. Story 151. I think Battlefield 1 does a great job explaining the details of World War I with its codex. Story 152. I learned a ton about World War II and World War I from the Battlefield series. Story 153. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas taught me more about business than school ever did. Real estate, time management, asset allocation, risk-taking and gambling, and the value of relaxation, relationships, and leisure activities. Story 154. I told my child I would buy her Animal Crossing when she learned how to read. Once she got the hang of it during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, she played for hours. When lockdown was lifted, she was far ahead of her classmates. Story 155. I learned a lot about trees, gems, mining, and other things from RuneScape. Not advanced stuff, of course, but as a kid it stuck with me. Story 156. As a mother of 5 children, I think all video games are educational. You should do other activities as well. Story 157. Assassin's Creed helped me get through my history classes by teaching historical events and key figures I still remember. Story 158. Want to learn how to farm rice? Play Sakuna of Rice and Ruin. It is very detailed and has excellent gameplay. Story 159. You can find a lot of information about the Cold War and nuclear weapons in the Metal Gear Solid series. Story 160. Europa Universalis will teach you more about world history than any class because you will agonize over the historical decisions you have to make. But beware, for the right kind of nerd, this is a life stealer. Story 161. I do not know how common this is nowadays, but playing text-based games in the multi-user dungeon style like Gemstone 3 greatly improved my speed reading ability. Story 162. Portal 2 is surprisingly educational with its problem-solving and physics concepts. Story 163. Any game, when not played in your native tongue, can be a great way to learn a second language. Story 164. Scribblenauts vastly expanded my vocabulary and knowledge base when I was a child. Story 165. Learning new games is all about managing systems. Menus, directions, maps, and heads-up displays. Okay, so it might be a video game with ninjas, lasers, and Italian plumbers. It still requires ingesting data, processing it, and using it to succeed. Along with any educational content in games, which this discussion has already mentioned at length, games teach players how to turn abstract information into functional, usable skills. Honorable mention, hand-eye coordination. We all use that every day. Story 166. Dark Souls taught me a lot. It showed me that it is normal to be bad at something at first and taught the value of persistence and improving your skills. The phrase "stop crying and get good" is infuriating when said at the wrong moment, but it can be a universal life lesson. Story 167. When I was a kid, the game Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego taught me capital cities, their currencies, and other facts. Story 168. Educational games have just gotten better. I was playing one recently that seemed to use the incredible machine formula and applied basic physics. It was halfway there, but to pass levels you have to pick the correct principles in play as well as solve the puzzle. Story 169. The only reason I became interested in politics and the Cold War was the Metal Gear Solid games. Story 170. All of them. It is just a question of what they are teaching, intentionally or not. One of my favorites, Disco Elysium, teaches many things, depending on what speaks to you the loudest. Story 171. World of Warcraft taught me that organizing anything with a group of people is a pain in the ass. Story 172. I think Portal 2 is great for middle school students. It opens their minds to creative problem solving and is a blast. Story 173. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games that favor text chat, such as World of Warcraft, can teach people languages and typing skills, and can also contribute to addictive behavior. Story 174. Paradox Interactive's games are not perfect, but they provide a good introduction to history. Story 175. Challenges teach patience and how to overcome adversity. They also help develop the mindset that this is hard, but I will do it. These are valuable skills for both adults and children. Story 176. Mario Brothers is fundamentally a fine motor skills, failure, and disappointment training module. These abilities are valuable to develop at an early age, in limited amounts. Story 177. Some games help with situational awareness. For example, World of Warcraft taught me not to stand in the fire and to look around even when things are intense. Games like chess can help you think a step ahead. Even card games like War can help with hand-eye coordination. Story 178. Capitalism 2, Superpower 2, Paradox Games, Kerbal Space Program, Dawn of Man, to name a few. Story 179. Battlefield 1 taught me many things about the Great War that I did not know. I knew of World War I in a vague way, but I did not know the notable battles or much about the politics involved. I realize it is a video game and much of it is dramatized and unrealistic, but at least I now know the names of several significant battles and the factions involved. Story 180. Cookie Clicker is an excellent way to help someone understand exponents and experience their scale, and it illustrates the differences between orders of magnitude. Playing the game makes it much easier to visualize what $1 million, $1 billion, and $1 trillion look like. Story 181. I would say World of Warcraft is useful for executive management education, especially for raid leaders. Thinking about the level of organization, team leadership, preparation, and recruitment required reminds me of managing a team of 25 to 40 people with lower-level managers overseeing every 5 individual contributors. Story 182. Pokemon. I learned many words and obscure colors playing Yellow, Gold, Silver, Crystal, and Ruby. I also developed a lot of knowledge about strategy and statistics. It complemented my extensive reading, since I was also a library nerd. Good times. Story 183. Most massively multiplayer online games with guilds and hierarchies teach you far more about social politics than you might expect. If you are a corporate board member in EVE Online, include that on your resume as management experience. Story 184. As a teacher, I had to assign computer applications to students to supplement math and reading. They are soul-sucking and take the joy out of learning. In addition, the constant rewards make computers addictive. Get your children off screens. Story 185. Satisfactory. Really good game for learning multiplication, division, and percentages. Also improves systemizing and working memory capabilities. Story 186. The Original Oregon Trail. I will die on that hill. Fight me. If you know, then you know. Story 187. A recent example is that the farmer was replaced. I was playing on Discord and streamed to a couple of friends. At one point, we discussed sorting algorithms and complexity while I wrote code to farm cacti. All of us had studied computer science, but I can see that the game could teach programming. Story 188. As a kid, I played a lot of edutainment games, and there was one called Treasure Mountain where you learned the big treasure was behind a bush with 3 red berries, so you wandered the mountain looking for that bush. You could also get treasures from 2 out of 3. Plants, trees with 3 red berries, bushes with 2 red berries, bushes with 3 blueberries, and so on. You could not zero in on a single clue. You had to look at everything as you walked around, but you could not check everything because the number of checks was limited. I think about that now when I ask my husband to remove something from the house and he has not noticed it at all. Or when someone posts to mildly interesting, hey, look, this whole batch of cranberry sauce was canned upside down because they had never noticed it before. Story 189. EVE Online. Economics, social dynamics, time management, and anger management. Story 190. Grand Theft Auto, Minecraft, and The Sims are my holy trinity. You definitely learn something in these games. Driving, building, and how genetics works. Story 191. Dynasty Warriors opened my younger mind to historical learning and cultural interest, leading me to read books outside school and to explore histories from parts of the world I otherwise would not have considered. The series has many hits and misses, but Dynasty Warriors 3, soon to be remastered, was one of the core stepping stones that shaped who I became. That game led me to reading, to writing, and to activities like tabletop role-playing games and wargaming. I am not a big fan of those games anymore, but they remain very special to me. Story 192. War Thunder taught me almost everything I know about tanks and modern aircraft. Fallout 4 taught me the value of morality over practicality, as I chose the Minutemen or the Railroad despite them requiring the most effort for the least reward. Story 193. Stationeers requires you to understand phase changes and chemical properties to avoid destroying your space base. Story 194. Massively multiplayer online games remind me of playing my first World of Warcraft clone in middle school, having previously mostly played Nintendo games. It taught me more about economics than high school ever did. It also taught me about optimization and using resources in unintuitive ways. For example, using mid-tier armor instead of high-tier armor because it was exponentially easier to upgrade, so it outperformed the high tier for the same cost. Story 195. There is nothing better for exercising reading comprehension and lateral thinking than old-school Infocom-style text adventures. At least the good ones. Story 196. Car Mechanic Sim is pretty great. Did it teach me how to fix cars? No, absolutely not. But it taught me what the parts are, what they do, roughly where they are located in the car, and why. Between that and Forza, I learned enough about cars and racing to hold my own in casual, car-related conversations, for example at car shows and similar events. I knew nothing about cars before that. I do not even drive in real life. Story 197. Valiant Hearts. The Great War. The developers aim to create a game that lets you learn about World War I through a storytelling puzzle-solving game. I thought they achieved this in an interesting way, and after playing I wanted a similar game about World War II and other wars. Story 198. Life is Strange and Telltale Games The Walking Dead are masterclasses in decision-making. They teach that every choice has consequences, often subtle ones. They enhance emotional intelligence and compel us to consider the moral dilemmas we face in life. Story 199. Medieval 2. Total War and Europa Universalis undoubtedly increased my final grade in Advanced Placement European History by 15 to 20 percentage points. Story 200. Assassin's Creed contained basic data and extensive descriptions of occupations, historical figures, and places. Story 201. This might sound childish, but you have no idea how much I have learned playing Minecraft, not with the intention of learning but simply for fun. Story 202. Final Fantasy and The Legend of Zelda taught me to read and to love stories when I was a child. I did not really start reading until I beat Final Fantasy VII and had my first little existential crisis, laughing out loud. Story 203. I definitely started doing better in school after playing Ocarina of Time and Baldur's Gate. Story 204. I learned how to read maps as a preteen by playing video games. Story 205. Any challenging roguelike game such as Dark Souls and Hollow Knight goes beyond infamous difficulty. These games teach persistence, analysis of mistakes, and strategic planning. You do not simply run and hack, you study enemy behavior, learn from losses, and ultimately find a way to win. This is a direct analogy to solving complex life problems. Story 206. Any game by Paradox Interactive is worthwhile, but the new Europa Universalis V is excellent at teaching history and geopolitical realities. Story 207. Flappy Bird. Just keep moving forward and do not let anything get in your way. Laugh out loud. Story 208. Shoutouts to Car Mechanic Simulator 2018. I don't know what people say about it, but I never would have thought it had the depth and real-life analogs. You learn, at a relatively high level, how a car is built in its entirety. From the engine block to shafts, pistons, alternator, and crankshaft all the way to the wheels, including the suspension, fuel intake system, rims, and bodywork. Nearly every major component is highlighted and shown in relation to the others. I can actually make rough sense of a V8 engine now. Amazing. Story 209. There are science fiction games like Mass Effect that arouse interest in space themes. Story 210. StarCraft in the 1990s taught me to type quickly. Story 211. Gran Turismo taught me a lot about various automakers, especially lesser-known brands like TVR, Chaparral, and Daihatsu. Story 212. This is anecdotal, but the only reason I was motivated to learn to read in elementary school was so I did not have to ask my father to read what the aliens in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic were saying. Can be motivational. Story 213. Pokemon names being puns were surprisingly helpful for learning new words when I was a kid and for spelling bees. Story 214. Take Red Dead Redemption 2. Sure, it's a cowboy game, but it's also a history and morality simulator. You see the fallout of industrialization, human greed, and how small choices mess with nature or people. It's basically Ethics 101 Horse Edition. Story 215. The Assassin's Creed franchise has incredible recreations of many iconic locations and time periods. They are the closest thing we have to a time machine. Story 216. During middle and high school, we had 20 new vocabulary words each week. I knew 2 to 4 of them because of video games. The rest of the class usually knew 0 to 1. Video games involve planning, visual spatial reasoning, strategy, impulse control, history, mythology, and much more. Story 217. I have been able to answer more than a few Jeopardy questions because of Civilization 5. Story 218. I learned much of my English from playing the Grand Theft Auto 5 story mode. I played it 6 times as a kid. I also forced my friends to play Minecraft in English with me. You also learn a great deal about history when playing Paradox interactive games. Much is simplified or unrealistic, but for example, I learned roughly the timeline of the 18th to 20th centuries by playing Europa Universalis 4, Victoria 3, and Hearts of Iron 4. I am from Germany, which is why I mentioned learning English with Grand Theft Auto 5 and Minecraft. Story 219. Quake and other first-person shooter games taught me to type very fast because typing left me standing still and vulnerable to being killed at any time. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.